You will sign nothing. You will spend nothing. And you will speak to no one of consequence without my leave." The words fell across the long dining hall of Holloway Court, like the first crack of lake ice in a thaw, sharp and final, and the footman standing at the sideboard went still as carved stone. Duke Lucian Marchbanks did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He set down his wine, folded the letter he had been reading, and looked at his wife of 3 months the way a man looks at a portrait that has been hung slightly crooked on his wall. "You came into this house with a quiet face and an empty name," he said, "and a wife with no fortune of her own is a guest who has forgotten she is a guest. You would do well to remember it." Serafina lowered her eyes to the white damask. She did not weep. She did not protest. She only set her fork down with a care so deliberate it seemed almost a kind of prayer, folding her hands in her lap, going very still, the kind of stillness that should have warned every proud soul in that frozen hall. It did not. No one in that candle-lit room knew that the bank which held the mortgage on Holloway Court, on its farms and its forests, and the very chair the Duke sat in, had 3 weeks ago passed into the sole and private ownership of the woman he had just ordered to be silent. Beyond the tall iced windows, past the white lawns and the long gravel drive, a single black carriage bearing no crest at all had already turned in at the distant gates, its lamps 2 small gold coins against the dark, and the man inside it carried a sealed packet that would, before this winter ended, unmake the proudest name in the county. But all of that was still to come. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video, because tonight's story of a silenced duchess and the bank that owned her husband is one you will never forget. Now, let us go back to the beginning, to how a woman with a quiet face came to hold a duke's whole world in her gloved hand. Holloway Court had not always been so cold a place. Once it had been the warmest house in the north, famous for its midwinter feasts, when the great hall blazed with 100 candles and the long tables groaned beneath roast pheasant and glazed venison, buttered parsnips and saffron pears, clear amber consommé and trembling custards set in silver. But the old Duke, Lucian's father, had loved cards more than crops and racing more than rent, and when he died he left behind a name that still commanded every beau in the county, and a fortune that had quietly turned to paper and promises. The roof of the east wing leaked behind its splendid cornices. The cellars held more dust than wine. Holloway Court was a beautiful house holding its breath, a grand old thing still wearing its diamonds, while the moths worked patiently behind the tapestries. And Lucian Marchbanks, who had inherited his father's pride, entire and almost none of his father's debts honestly, had married to make the arithmetic come right. He had been told that the Holloway estate could be saved by a marriage to new money, and money, he had decided, was the only honest thing a wife was for. So, a match had been made, the way such matches were always made, in a drawing room over weak tea. Between the proud and the practical, Serafina was the only daughter of Edmund Carew, a man whose name was spoken in the same careful low tone in the city that the Duke's name was spoken in the county. To the gentry, Edmund Carew was nobody. A man of ledgers and interest, a man who had built rather than inherited. And that was the worst thing a man could be in their eyes. The Marchbanks family took his daughter and his promised settlement, and looked down the entire length of their long noses at where the money had come from. They did not know, because Edmund Carew had been a man who told the world only what it needed to know. That he had died that very autumn and left his only child not merely a settlement, but the whole of his quiet, vast, and careful empire. The warehouses along the river, the shipping concerns whose flags flew in a dozen far harbors, and above all the private bank of Carew and Halsey, which held in its iron vaults the mortgages of half the great houses in 3 counties, including, as it happened, the mortgage of Holloway Court itself, signed in a moment of desperation by the late Duke at a green baize table at 3 in the morning, and never, ever mentioned to his son. Serafina had loved her father as the gentry never loved theirs, and he had loved her back without an ounce of the cold ceremony she would later find at Holloway. Edmund Carew had built his bank out of nothing but a careful mind and a kept word, and he had raised his daughter at his own elbow, teaching her to read a ledger before she could read a psalter, teaching her that a column of figures was the most honest sentence ever written because it could not lie and would not flatter. The grand folk will smile at your money and sneer at your name, Seraphina, he had told her once, in the lamplit warmth of his city counting house with the rain on the glass. And you must let them, and you must keep your figures truer than their manners, because manners can be bought in an afternoon. But the truth a man keeps in his books is the only fortune that outlasts him. She had been 17 then, and she had not understood the whole of it. She understood it entirely now. When the cancer took him, slow and patient through that long last autumn, he had held her hand at the end and made her promise only one thing: not to marry for love, which he knew the world would not allow her, and not to marry for safety, which he thought beneath her, but to marry where she might one day do some good, and to keep her own counsel until she knew which kind of good was wanted. The Marchbanks match had come to him on his deathbed, and he had looked at the name of the proud, cold duke who held his paper, and he had smiled a small, thin smile that his daughter did not understand until a great deal later, and he had said only, "Yes, that one. He will need you more than he can imagine, child, and a house that is too proud to know it is drowning is the very house most worth the saving." Seraphina arrived at Halloway in November in a plain gray traveling dress, her father 3 weeks in the grave, her heart a closed and careful room, and the first thing she noticed was how the servants flinched. The house itself she took in at a single sweeping glance. The avenue of bare black limes, the frozen ornamental lake, the great gray pile of the court rising up against a bruised winter sky, all of it magnificent and all of it, to her trained merchant's eye, quietly failing. She saw the green stains weeping down the splendid stone where a gutter had gone unmended. She saw the blind, dark windows of the closed-up east wing where the roof had begun to let the weather in. She saw a house wearing its finery, the way a proud invalid wears a ball gown, beautiful from across the room and breaking quietly underneath, and she understood the whole of the Marchbanks' fortune in the time it took the carriage to roll up the drive. But it was the people who told her the truest tale. She noticed the scullery maid who set down the coal scuttle too loudly and was struck across the knuckles with a fan by the housekeeper for it. She noticed the old gardener turned out into the sleet for letting a single rose go to frost, his cap in his chapped hands, asking only for a character and not being given one. She noticed the footmen who stood like furniture and were addressed like furniture, never named, never thanked, never seen. She noticed that in this great cold house, no one was ever thanked and no one was ever spared, and she filed each small cruelty away in the same quiet ledger her father had taught her to keep, where nothing was ever forgotten and nothing was ever spent in anger. For a debt remembered in patience, Edmund Caro had taught her, is worth 10 paid back in temper. A wife is to be seen at dinner and not heard at any other time, her new husband informed her on the first evening, over a table set for 40, that held only the two of them and his cousin, and Seraphina inclined her head and said, "As you wish, your grace," and meant something by it that he did not trouble himself to hear. The cousin was the third presence at Halloway Court, and the most dangerous, though he wore the prettiest manners. His name was Gideon Vale, a younger son of a younger son, all charm and no inheritance, who had attached himself to the Duke's household the way ivy attaches itself to a failing wall, and who had spent a year and a half teaching Lucian to see his own wife through the cheapest possible glass. It was Gideon who murmured, as the carriage carrying Seraphina's modest trunks had first come up the drive, "A merchant's girl, cousin. You may have to teach her which fork." It was Gideon who arranged the seating, so that the Duke's hard-faced aunt, the Dowager Lady Marchbanks, sat always at Seraphina's elbow to correct her use of the soup spoon before guests. And it was Gideon Vale who had begun, very softly, very patiently, to count the days until a childless marriage to a merchant's daughter might be quietly undone, the settlement kept, and the awkward girl returned to the city with a small allowance and a closed mouth, for he had his own plans for Halloway Court, and a wife between him and the estate was an inconvenience that pride and a little law could surely be made to remove. Seraphina saw all of it. She saw it the way a clear pond sees the sky, taking everything in and giving nothing back. She watched her husband across the breadth of his cold table, and understood him almost at once. Not a wicked man, she decided, but a frozen one. A man who had been taught from the cradle that warmth was weakness, and that to need anything, even kindness, was a kind of shame. She watched Gideon Vale smile and saw the calculation moving behind his eyes like a fish under ice, and she said nothing, and signed nothing, and spent nothing, exactly as she had been ordered, because Serafina Caro had not come north to win an argument over the soup. She had come to bury her father, who had loved her, and to take the measure of the man she had been bound to, and to decide, in her own time and on her own terms, what she would do with the extraordinary and secret power that now lay sleeping in a locked black box at the bottom of her traveling trunk. It was on a gray afternoon in the second month that Serafina learned exactly what was being planned against her, and she learned it the way the wronged so often do, by being treated as furniture. The great library at Halloway Court ran the length of the south front, 2 stories of leather and dust and tall cold windows, and Serafina had taken to walking there in the early dark because it was the one room no one else troubled to enter, and the books did not flinch when she came near. She was high on the gallery stair, half hidden among the shelves with a volume of poems open in her hands, when the heavy door below opened and the Duke came in with his cousin, and neither of them so much as glanced upward, because a wife who has been told to be silent has, in such men's minds, no more presence than a clock. "It cannot go on, Lucian, you must see that," Gideon Vale was saying, and his charming drawing-room voice had gone flat and businesslike now that there was no audience to charm. "Quigley brought the figures again this morning. The interest on your father's debt comes due at the spring quarter, and there is not the half of it in the whole estate. The bank will foreclose. They will take Halloway, the farms, the timber, all of it, and you will be a duke with a title and a rented room." There was the scrape of a chair, the clink of a decanter, and then the Duke's voice, cold and tired. "Then we sell the western farms." "You cannot sell what is already pledged against the debt," the cousin said, with the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a child. "There is one road out, cousin, and you know what it is." The girl. "The Caro settlement is generous, but it is a stream when what you need is a river, and the marriage is barren and you have grown to despise her, which makes everything simpler. Set her aside. There are grounds enough if a man wants them found, and old Halsey at the bank is a sentimental fool who will grant any annulment that keeps a duke's good opinion. We keep the settlement, we send the merchant's daughter back to her ledgers, and then, cousin, you are free to marry where the money is truly deep." A long silence. Then, Gideon Vale said the words that Serafina would carry quietly down the gallery stair and hold to herself for many weeks. The words, "A wife with no fortune is never meant to hear. A wife with nothing to her name is the easiest thing in the world to set aside. She came with empty hands. She will leave with empty hands. No one of consequence will ever ask after her again." Serafina stood very still among the books, while the cold afternoon light moved across the spines, and she did not let so much as a single page rustle. She heard her husband say nothing at all in her defense, which told her everything she needed to know about his frozen heart, and she heard the 2 men gather their papers and go, their voices warming again into easy laughter the moment they passed back into the lit part of the house. She came down the gallery stair when she was certain they were gone, and she found that her hands were perfectly steady. A wife with empty hands, she thought. They had no idea. They had no idea at all whose hands they thought were empty. On her way back to her own cold rooms, Serafina came upon a young housemaid weeping in the dark of the back passage, a girl of perhaps 15 with chapped red hands and a livid mark blooming across her cheek, where the housekeeper had struck her for breaking a teacup of the second best set. "Hush now," Serafina said softly, and she knelt down on the cold stone in her fine gray dress and took the girl's frightened face in her 2 warm hands. "What is your name?" "Annie, my lady," the girl managed, terrified to be seen, terrified to be heard. "It was only a cup, my lady. I swear I'll pay for it, only please don't tell, please." "You will pay for nothing, Annie," Serafina said, and she pressed her own clean handkerchief into the girl's hands, the linen edged with a small embroidered C that no one in that house had ever thought to wonder about. A house that breaks a child over a teacup has broken something far more precious than china, and that is not your fault. And it never was. Dry your eyes. Better days are coming to this house than you can imagine, I should know." And though Annie did not understand the strange certainty in the quiet new Duchess's voice, she stopped crying, and she never forgot it. And she would come to matter very much before the winter was done. If the Duke and his cousin had thought Seraphina cowed by her silence, they were soon disabused, not because she fought them, but because she would not break. And there is nothing so maddening to a cruel man as a wife who simply will not break. So they pressed harder, the way bullies always do when their cruelty finds no purchase. The Dowager Lady Marchbanks, the Duke's aunt, a woman of 70 with a face like a closed purse and a tongue dipped in vinegar, came to stay for the Christmas season, and with her came a houseful of the county's best people, the earls and the honorables and the daughters with names like Jewelry, and Halloway Court roused itself for one last grand performance, blazing with its 100 candles and its towering hothouse flowers and its tables of roast swan and spiced pears and glittering aspic, all of it bought on credit that everyone in the county pretended not to know about. And it was at the great Christmas dinner before the cream of 3 counties that Lucian Marchbanks set out to humiliate his wife in earnest. The night of it came on hard and clear and bitter, the lake below the lawns frozen black and groaning, the long windows furred white with frost, and inside Halloway Court blazed against the dark as it had not blazed in years. 100 wax candles stood in the great branched candelabra and the chandeliers, their light caught and thrown back 1,000-fold by the cut crystal and the old silver and the gilt of the picture frames. The hothouse had been stripped bare to bank the tables with white roses and trailing ivy and great pale lilies forced out of season at ruinous cost. The board groaned beneath a roasted swan dressed in its own feathers, a baron of beef, a brace of glazed hams studded with cloves, terrines and jellied larks and oysters packed in straw and ice carried by relay from the coast, spiced pears and quince, and a towering subtlety of spun sugar shaped like the Halloway crest, and chilled syllabubs trembling in 200 little silver cups, all of it, every last gleaming morsel, bought upon a credit that everyone at the table knew about and no one would name, the way a man at a hanging does not mention the rope. It was, Seraphina thought, watching from the cold edge of the room, a very expensive way to drown. He did it coldly, as he did everything. When the company processed into the great hall and took their places by rank, there was no place laid for the Duchess at her husband's right hand, where the lady of the house belonged. There was no place laid for her at the high table at all. A footman, scarlet to the ears and unable to meet her eyes, murmured that her grace was to be seated at the lower table, below the great silver salt cellar that divided the worthy from the merely tolerated, among the poor relations and the curate, in the place reserved for those whose presence is suffered rather than desired. A ripple of delighted, scandalized whispering ran the length of the hall. The dowager smiled into her wine, and Gideon Vale, seated splendidly at the Duke's right hand, in the place that should have been his wife's, lifted a sheaf of papers just high enough for the nearest guests to see the heavy seal upon them, and let it be murmured down the table that these were the annulment papers, drawn and ready, that the Duke had at last seen sense and meant to be free of his merchant bride by the new year. "One cannot make a silk purse of a counting-house," the dowager observed to the table at large, in a carrying voice. "She has the manners of her ledgers. Some women are simply born to be set aside." Seraphina walked the long length of that hall to her place below the salt with her head high and her step unhurried, and she did not flush, and she did not falter, and the whispering died a little in spite of itself as she passed, because there was something in the way she carried her humiliation that did not look like shame at all. She took her seat among the curate and the poor cousins. She unfolded her napkin, and when the dowager's cruel observation reached her down the table, and the laughter rose, Seraphina looked up the long bright length of the hall to where her husband sat in his stolen warmth. And she spoke for the first time that whole evening, in a voice that was quiet and clear and carried further than any shout. "Some houses, my lady," she said, "are kept standing only by the good will of those they most despise. It would be a pity to learn that lesson too late." The dowager's smile curdled. The Duke's eyes narrowed across the candle-lit hall. They did not understand the words, but the words went very still inside them all the same, the way cold water goes still before it freezes, and somewhere far off, beyond the iced windows and the white lawn and the long dark drive, the wheels of a plain black carriage were already crunching up the gravel toward Holloway Court. The doors of the great hall opened upon the bitter night, while the laughter still hung in the candle smoke, and the cold came in like a living thing, guttering every flame on the long tables at once, so that the whole proud company turned as one toward the dark. A man stood in the doorway, in a plain dark traveling coat dusted with snow. An unremarkable man, with a leather case under his arm, and ink-stained fingers, and the particular unhurried stillness of someone who has come to do business that cannot be refused. Behind him in the night could be seen the lamps of not one carriage now but four, drawn up in a silent line along the drive, and the dark shapes of men climbing down from them. "I beg the company's pardon for the hour," the man said, and his quiet city voice fell into the frozen hall with more weight than all the dowager's vinegar. "I am Mr. Halsey, of the private bank of Caro and Halsey. I am come on the most urgent business of the bank, and I must speak at once with the holder of the Holloway accounts." The Duke rose in his place, white with affront, certain in his bones that he was about to be ruined before the whole county, that the foreclosure had come a season early, that the worst day of his proud life had arrived at his own Christmas table. "I am the Duke of Holloway," he said coldly. "You will speak your business to me." And Mr. Halsey of the bank looked at him with something almost like pity, and then he turned and he walked the entire length of that great hall, past the Duke, past the smirking cousin with his sealed papers, past the curdled dowager and the gaping earls and the daughters with names like jewelry, and he stopped at the very lowest table, below the salt, and he set down his leather case, and he bowed from the waist, deep and grave, to the silent woman seated among the poor relations. "Your Grace," he said, "forgive the intrusion. The new owner of the bank required that the papers be placed into your hands tonight, and into no others. They are signed. The whole concern is yours, as your late father always intended, and with it," he laid a single heavy document upon the table before her, "the mortgage of this house and every debt of the Marchbank's name, which fall due, as you know, at your sole word." The silence that followed was the loudest sound that Hall had heard in 100 years. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered unheard upon the marble. The Duke stood frozen with one hand still upon the back of his chair, his face draining of all its hard color, as the whole architecture of his understanding came down around him stone by silent stone. Seraphina rose from her place below the salt. She did not hurry. She drew off her plain gray gloves one finger at a time, and laid them upon the table beside the deed, and where the dowager had seen a merchant's awkward girl there now stood something none of them had ever once thought to look for. A woman entirely unafraid, in full possession of herself and of them. The daughter of Edmund Caro standing in her own house at last. "My father," she said into the ringing quiet, "was Edmund Caro of Caro and Halsey, who held the mortgage of this house from the night the late Duke could not pay his card debts and was too proud to let his son be told. My father died this autumn and left me everything, which is rather more than nothing, my lady." Her eyes found the dowager, who had gone the color of old paper. "When you said some women are born to be set aside, you were speaking, it seems, of the woman who owns the bed you slept in last night, and the bank that holds the roof above your head." She turned to Gideon Vale, whose charming face had cracked clean across like dropped china, the sealed annulment papers slack and forgotten in his hand. "And you, cousin, who counted the days until a wife with empty hands could be sent back to her ledgers, I heard every word you spoke in the library. So, I think, did Mr. Halsey, to whom I wrote it all down. A wife with nothing, you said, is the easiest thing in the world to set aside." She let the silence stretch until it ached. "Let us discover, then, how easy it is to set aside a wife who owns everything you have ever called your own." It was Mr. Halsey of the bank who spoke the cousin's ruin aloud, in the same flat, unhurried city voice, because Seraphina had decided long before that night that she would not soil her own mouth with the doing of it, that the world, and the ledgers, and the cold turning of debts coming due would deliver the justice, while she stood above it with clean hands. "It may interest the company to know," Mr. Halsey said mildly, opening his leather case, that Mr. Gideon Vale's own debts, of which there are a great and colorful many, were quietly bought up by this same bank over the past several months, at Miss Caro's particular instruction, against precisely such an evening as this. His notes to his tailor, his wine merchant, his bootmaker, and 3 separate gaming establishments are now all held in one hand. They fall due, by the terms upon which I purchased them, tomorrow morning. Gideon Vale made a small, strangled sound, and the steward Quigley, Mr. Halsey went on, who has for 2 years been skimming the rents of the Halloway tenants into his own pocket and laying the shortfall at his master's door, will find the bank's auditors waiting upon him at dawn. The figures do not lie, sir. They never have. They merely wait. The hall, which had come for a Christmas feast, sat in stunned and shamed silence among the cooling swan and the guttered candles, and one by one the proud faces of 3 counties turned away from the broken duke and his ruined cousin, because nothing empties a room of friends so fast as the smell of money gone. And by the new year the society pages would carry it all. The merchant's daughter, who had been seated below the salt and had risen owning the bank, the cousin hauled before his creditors, the steward dismissed in disgrace, the proudest house in the north, saved only by the goodwill of the very woman it had tried to throw away. The justice came, in the weeks that followed, exactly as Seraphina had let it come, not by her hand, but by the slow and certain hand of the world, which is patient and exact and forgets nothing. Gideon Vale, his debts called all in at once on a cold morning, found every door in the county that had opened to his charm now shut against the smell of his ruin. His tailor came for him, and his wine merchant, and a heavy-shouldered man from the worst of the gaming houses who did not knock, and the fine friends who had laughed at his jokes at the Halloway table, discovered, all at once and all together, that they had pressing engagements elsewhere. The society pages, which a fortnight before had carried the splendor of the Duke's Christmas, now carried the cousin's fall in column after relishing column. The charming Mr. V, ruined overnight, it was whispered, by a debt no one had known he owed to a bank no one had known he should fear. He left the north on a public coach with 1 trunk and no friends, his sealed annulment papers good for nothing now but lighting a fire, and Seraphina never spoke his name again, nor needed to, for the world had said it quite enough. The Dowager Lady Marchbanks, who had a small jointure of her own and a very large opinion of herself, discovered that the small jointure had been invested, years ago, in a Caro concern, and that the new owner of that concern was disinclined to be cruel but perfectly capable of being exact. She lived out her years in a comfortable cottage on the estate, on an allowance from the niece she had despised, which was a mercy she had never once shown to anyone and never quite learned to forgive. The steward Quigley went to answer for his thefts, and Lucian Marchbanks, Duke of Halloway, who had told his wife she would sign nothing and spend nothing and speak to no one without his leave, sat at the head of his cold table the morning after the feast, and understood, at last and completely, that the woman across from him had held his entire world in her gloved hand from the night she arrived, and had chosen, every day of their cruel acquaintance, not to crush it. He found her in the great library, where the cold afternoon light moved across the spines exactly as it had on the day she overheard her own betrayal. He stood a long while in the doorway before she lifted her eyes from her book. "You could have ruined me," he said at last, and his proud, cold voice had something in it she had never heard before, something cracked and bare. "You could have foreclosed the night you arrived. You held my name in your hand for 3 months while I treated you." He could not finish it. "Why did you not?" Seraphina closed her book. "Because ruining a man tells you nothing about him," she said quietly, "and I wished to know what manner of man I had married before I decided what to do with him. A cruel man, I found. A frozen one. But not, I think, a wicked one. There is a difference, and the difference is whether warmth is dead in a man or only buried." She rose and crossed to him, and looked up into the face that had looked at her so coldly across so many dinners. "You were taught that to need anything was shame. I was taught by a man who built a bank out of nothing that to need others is simply the truth, and that the only sin is to despise the people you need. I do not want your title, Lucian. I had a name of my own long before I took yours, and I do not want your ruin, because I have learned that ruined men are tediously the same, while a man who is humbled and knows it can, on rare occasion, become something better. She let that hang. I am keeping Holloway Court because it is mine, bought and paid for. The only question that remains is whether its duke would like to stay and learn from his own wife how a great house is kept warm, or whether he would prefer a comfortable cottage near his aunt. He went down, then. This proud, cold duke, not to his knees exactly, but in every way that mattered, his whole frozen architecture come quietly, undone in the gray library light, and he reached for her hand, the way a man reaches for the first warmth after a long winter, half afraid it will not be real. "Stay," he said, "teach me. God help me. I have been a fool in a fine coat my whole life, and I did not know there was another way to be until a merchant's daughter sat below my own salt and shamed 3 counties with her silence. Stay, Seraphina, not because the bank is yours and the house is yours and you might, because I am asking, because I find, to my very great astonishment, that I cannot imagine the keeping of this house, or of myself, without you in it." And Seraphina, who had buried her father and crossed a cold country and sat below the salt and held her terrible power in patient gloved hands all winter, looked at the undone man before her and saw that the warmth was not dead after all, but only long buried and beginning, at last, to thaw. She let him keep her hand. She did not forget the kindnesses owed, for a woman who keeps a careful ledger keeps the column of debts and the column of kindnesses both. The housekeeper, who had struck a child over a teacup, was pensioned off without a character, and young Annie of the chapped hands was brought up from the cold back passages and made the Duchess's own maid, dressed warm in good wool, taught her letters in the great library of an evening by the Duchess's own hand, and never struck again in that house as long as she lived. And it was Annie who, years later, would tell her own children the story of the gray winter she had wept over a broken cup in a dark corridor, and a quiet lady in fine gray had knelt on the cold stone and told her that better days were coming than she could imagine. They came. Holloway Court grew warm again, warmer than it had been in living memory, not the brittle, credit-bought blaze of that last, cruel Christmas, but a real and steady warmth, its leaking roof mended, its cheated tenants made whole, its long tables open once more at midwinter to roast pheasant and glazed venison and saffron pears, and the laughter of children, and to anyone in the county, high or low, who came in from the cold in need of a place at the fire. And the Duke, who had once decreed that his wife would speak to no one of consequence without his leave, learned to take her arm at the head of his own table and present her, with a pride entirely new to him, as the woman who had saved his house and his name and his frozen foolish heart and meant every word. For in the end it was not the deed, nor the bank, nor the calling in of debts that won the thing worth winning. The money had only ever bought her the time to choose. What she chose was mercy, where she might have had revenge, and patience, where she might have had ruin, and a buried man made warm again instead of a proud man brought low. Pride may build a great cold house and fill it with 100 candles, but it is only ever kindness that keeps the fire lit through the long winter, and the truest fortune any soul can hold is the power to ruin another, and the grace to set it gently down. If this story warmed you on a cold night, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next tale from the great, cold houses of the past. And tell us in the comments, was Seraphina right to give her cruel cousin Gideon over to his creditors and let the world deliver his ruin, or should she have shown even him the mercy she showed her humble duke? And let us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it was when you finished this story. Until next time, remember that the coldest house can still be thawed, and the proudest heart can still be taught by the one person patient enough to hold its whole world in her hand and choose, instead of breaking it, to keep it warm.